Good day. Over the last couple of hours, discussions between the United States and Russia in Geneva have already started. It's been confirmed that the two delegations, led by Sergei Ryabkov on behalf of Russia and Wendy Sherman on behalf of the United States, are already in Geneva and are apparently already having preliminary discussions and soundings with each other. There will then be a further plenary meeting tomorrow in which the proper negotiations will take place and get underway. And after that, after those negotiations are concluded, they will then move on to a second meeting at the NATO-Russia Council on the 12th of January and a further meeting at the OSCE, which will be attended by Ukraine on the 13th. Now, in advance of these discussions, and as I discussed in my previous video, it's become clear that there is considerable confusion and uncertainty about the US position. The US has not provided or put forward coherent or intelligible counter-proposals to the Russians, which would address Russian concerns. What they have come up with, as we will discuss shortly, are certain token proposals, which, however, don't come anywhere close to meeting the sort of demands that the Russians are making. Now, can I say that before we proceed to look at these discussions, these comments that have been passing around from the United States, that we've also received information via CNN that the United States government has been warned by analytical teams in the State Department and the Treasury that that the kind of sanctions that have been mooted and talked about, which might be imposed on Russia in the event of a conflict in Ukraine that involved Russia, that those sort of sanctions would in fact be damaging potentially for the United States and almost certainly for Europe as well. And the title from CNN reads, Biden officials weighing Russia sanctions options after warnings about economic fallout, heightened cyber risk for US and allies. I'm going to put aside discussion about cyber risks, which I think are perhaps overstated. But let's just focus on what the United States itself is talking about, these massive sanctions that it's been discussing. We read in the CNN article that some Biden administration officials are warning of collateral economic damage from harsh sanctions and the risk of retaliatory Russian cyber attacks should the US follow through with President Biden's promised severe consequences on the Russian economy if Russian President Putin orders a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. At least two analyses done in recent weeks by the Treasury and the State Department found that the sanctions that would be most crippling for Russia, like penalties on the Russian energy giant Gazprom or its central bank, could also damage economies throughout the rest of the world by potentially spiking gas prices or hampering European trade and investment with Russia at a particularly delicate moment for the bloc. One concern is that those negative effects could boomerang back onto the US during an election year, sources told CNN. The extent of the blowback would largely depend on the parameters of the sanctions and how much Europe would suffer, said Jeff Schott, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, who focuses on international trade policy and economic sanctions. The problem with discussing these countermeasures is that if you take a strong sanctions action that has a big impact on the European economy, that will in turn rebound to the US economy. The administration has been considering options, including targeting major Russian commercial banks, sanctioning Russia's energy sector, blocking Russia's access to bond markets, cutting Russia off from SWIFT international payment system, and tightening export control measures. Amongst the most realistic economic penalties that the United States and its allies could impose would be to kill the Russia to Germany gas pipeline project Nord Stream 2, Scholz said, which when operational will account for about 10 to 15% of EU gas consumption, but will bypass Ukraine. US officials have been lobbying Germany to commit to kill the pipeline if Russia invades Ukraine, according to a senior US official. Officials are also mindful of the possibility of Russian retaliation in cyberspace against US and European critical infrastructure. The potential for such spillover is weighing on how the US responds to any Russian incursion and will also affect how allies react as the US works to coordinate a response for maximum effect. Now, the interesting thing about this article, or at least one of the interesting things, is that it's quite clear that despite all the brave talk that we've been hearing over the last few days and weeks, the actual sanctions package has not yet been agreed. It's still apparently a topic of discussion and negotiation within the administration itself and between the administration and the EU and the various member states of the EU. And a growing awareness is now apparent that some of the actions that have been talked about, like cutting Russia off from SWIFT, sanctioning Russian gas exports, all those sort of things, that they would have a massive effect on the EU economy. And since the United States is integrated into the EU economy, ultimately on the United States itself. Specifically, cutting off Russian natural gas supplies to Europe would inevitably result in a massive worldwide spike in natural gas prices, this coming at a time of already elevated inflation in all the major economies. It would also incidentally have massive knock-on effects on food prices, natural gas being an essential component in preparing and producing chemical fertilizer, which is essential for food production. So a massive upward spike to inflation. And of course, if we're going to talk about cutting Russia off from SWIFT, or at least Russia's major commercial banks from SWIFT, or taking measures to try to prevent the Russians or make it more difficult for the Russians to convert rubles into rubles into foreign currency, hard currency, dollars, sterling, and euros, and vice versa. Well, the problem with that is that would complicate payment mechanisms which the Europeans rely upon at the moment in order to pay the Russians for their gas. Almost certainly the Europeans would find in time ways around that. I've already discussed the fact that promissory notes would almost certainly come back into existence in order to meet these sorts of payments, but that would, of course, in effect, negate the effect of these sanctions, whilst causing massive disruption to European companies and European businesses, many of which have trade connections and investments in Russia. And of course, if we go a further step beyond that, then a crisis in the European economy is going to affect the United States. That is inevitable. One of the consequences of globalization, this economic system that the United States, or at least its political class, have been pushing so relentlessly on the world ever since the Cold War ended, one consequence of globalization is that the United States is now itself, in effect, a prisoner of it. It would be affected just as every other major economy around the world would be affected as a result of the blowback from such sanctions and in fact it would be affected more than most. Now, I'm not going to discuss in this program the Russian response to these sanctions. It seems to me that the Russians have multiple possible responses to these sanctions. They would, it seems to me, swiftly go over to the kind of economy that they have operated in the past, if you like, a kind of war or mobilization economy, which would very rapidly mitigate and absorb the effects of sanctions. The idea that Russia would be destroyed economically by disconnection for SWIFT, or that the Russians would be affected materially by restrictions on sales of iPhones, is an absolutely fantastic one. In the case of the second, all that would do is it would create a space for a Russian smartphone industry to rapidly develop and evolve, just as has happened in other industrial sectors which the US has attempted to restrict exports or exports of products to. And it would, in fact, in probability, strengthen the Russian economy rather than weaken it. And of course, if we're talking about a worldwide rise in gas prices, it's highly likely that with Russia still exporting liquefied natural gas, and with a worldwide shortage of liquefied natural gas, the Russians would, to a very great extent at least, mitigate whatever losses they suffered from export of pipeline gas to Europe as a result of the much higher prices for liquefied natural gas, which they would presumably still be selling and which would be under massive demand around the world. So it's highly likely that the Russians would absorb this hit, but that the United States and the Europeans would be massively disrupted by it. And I'm going to say something further. Democratic Party strategists, the sort of people who are advising the Biden-Harris administration, are going to tell the administration, under no circumstances do this. They will want every fibre, every effort made to try to prevent sanctions like this, which could result in double-digit inflation in the United States in the run-up to the November midterms, resulting in a likely clean sweep by the Republicans. I think, therefore, these kind of warnings, despite all the brave words we are hearing in the United States, are going to be a massive deterrent in the United States in imposing sanctions of this nature, and is going to make the United States more inclined towards some kind of compromise, or at least make the United States more anxious in order to try to find some kind of resolution of the crisis with the Russians. That, however, inevitably is going to create tensions within the United States administration itself. And already, I should say that there are clear signs, at least to me, of a split. One of the most interesting developments over the last few days is a frankly deranged press conference held by Secretary of State Blinken on Friday. It's one of the most weird press conferences I have ever seen, but the impression I got was of a man who was absolutely furious. And I suspect that what has made him angry, particularly angry, is the fact that he has just probably been on the receiving end of one of these reports, and probably warnings from, as I said, the Democratic Party strategists, the people in the DNC, telling him under no circumstances go down the road of this kind of sanctions project, because if you do, we can kiss goodbye to any chance of holding on to Congress in November. And I mean, his anger, Blinken's anger, is a wonder to behold. And the press conference is, to be straightforward, actually, in some respects, extraordinary. I mean, it began with a denial of a commitment that was indisputably made. The commitment in question was the commitment which was given to the Russians at the end of the 1980s, that if they agreed to the unification of Germany, there would be no NATO expansion eastwards. Blinken categorically denies that such a promise was ever given, even though there is now multiple corroboration, including from declassified documents provided by the United States government itself, which confirms beyond any shadow of a doubt that such a promise was indeed made, and indeed repeatedly made, not just by the US government, but by other NATO governments also. Having denied a commitment which was undoubtedly made, he then invented a commitment which does not exist. He claimed that Russia is in violation of the Minsk agreements that require settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, the agreement that sets out the pathway to a settlement of the Ukrainian conflict. He didn't say in what way Russia was in violation of the Minsk agreement, because, as of course he must indisputably know, Russia took on no commitments in the Minsk agreement, except at the very end of the process, after negotiations were agreed and a new constitution was agreed. At the end of the sequencing, the Russians would agree to return control of Ukraine's border back to Ukraine, but this would only happen after a new constitution had been agreed, following internal negotiations, and after a new election and a new national unity government within Ukraine had taken place. Until that point, no commitments have been made by the Russians, and none exist in the Minsk agreement. And as I said, Blinken didn't in fact say what agreements the Russians had breached, had violated in the Minsk agreement, because of course none have, because none, at least in the form that he says, exist. He also, by the way, complained that the Russians refused to agree to become a party, that they are a party to the Ukrainian conflict. Comments which make me wonder, actually, whether the idea of trying to persuade the Russians to become a party to the conflict and to engage the Ukrainians in direct negotiations might have come from him. He made all sorts of other really strange observations. He claimed that the Russians had attacked and invaded Georgia and Ukraine. Well, let's put aside the question of Ukraine. Let's talk about Georgia. As, of course, you must know, the European Union carried out an investigation after the Russia-Georgia war of 2008, and that EU investigation concluded that it was Georgia that actually launched the war and not Russia. But then perhaps the most bizarre and grotesque aspect of the whole press conference came when Blinken made it clear, or made it seem, that the negotiations which are due to take place in Geneva are about Ukraine. And a journalist then asked him whether this contradicts the US position that there can be no negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine itself being present. And caught unawares, if you like, by this, Blinken had to accept or admit that, in fact, the discussions in Geneva between the United States and Russia would not, in truth, be about Ukraine at all. They would be about bilateral matters. The press conference then concluded with an utterly fantastical debate about the discussion from Blinken about the situation in Kazakhstan, in which he seemed to query the legitimacy, the legality of the Russian deployment of troops to Kazakhstan, even though Kazakhstan had in fact requested the deployment of those troops. And then he also made the really quite extraordinary statement about the fact that if you invite the Russians into your house, it's difficult sometimes to get them to leave. Countries like Syria, for example, where the United States is present, countries like Iraq, other countries around the world must be wondering what the United States is talking about, given how the US acts when it deploys troops to those sort of countries. Anyway, that was a very bizarre, very weird press conference from Blinken, one which, as I said, suggests to me anger, probably at the receipt of these reports, and also dissension within the administration. And I say dissension because, of course, the following day, our old friend, the senior administration official, presumably Jake Sullivan, gave an anonymous press conference in the White House in which he gave a rather different picture of the negotiations in Geneva. First of all, it was fairly clear from the comments of the senior administration official that the discussion would not actually be about Ukraine. It would be about bilateral issues. It would be about trying to respond to the Russian demand for legally binding security guarantees. He didn't offer actually very much. In fact, he didn't offer anything. He said that the question of an end to NATO's eastward expansion, that was non-negotiable. The issue of US troops in Eastern Europe, well, that was not on the table either. He seemed to say that the US was open to discussion about deployment of missile systems in Ukraine. He denied that the United States had any intention to deploy missile systems in Ukraine. He did insist on some form of reciprocity, and it's completely unclear what kind of reciprocity he was referring to, what the Russians are supposed to do in return for that. The Russians, by the way, have already rejected out of hand all those suggestions. And, of course, the senior administration official also talked about some kind of agreements about reducing the size of drills, of exercises on the NATO side in return for reductions of exercises on the Russian side. By the way, the Russians have rejected that also. So, having said that, the tone was far more conciliatory and far more moderate, and is an extraordinary study in contrasts with the incredibly belligerent comments made by Blinken on the previous day. I would say that the senior administration official came up with no new thinking at all. He didn't seem to have any clearly formulated policy or set of responses. He appeared to see the negotiations in Geneva merely as a sounding board for understanding Russian intentions. But at least, as I said, he seemed prepared to sit down and talk with the Russians, which seemed very different from the kind of tone that Blinken was taking. Now, that suggests to me that there are real disagreements, as I said, within the administration. There must be increasing concerns on the part of people within the administration that the kind of sanctions that are being talked about will, as I said, derail any prospect of the Democrats holding on to Congress in the November midterms, perhaps sparking an even more severe economic crisis than that, and that, of course, the Europeans might also be unwilling to go along with some of the more extreme sanctions that are being proposed. Mario Draghi, the Italian Prime Minister, has actually made public comments about the fact that Europe cannot hope to survive economically, at least for the time being, without Russian gas, and that already seems to make this whole idea of imposing sanctions on Gazprom unrealistic. So the United States is left either with pursuing a sanctions package which is much weaker than what has been in practice threatened, or alternatively finding some way to negotiate with the Russians, even if it isn't really in a position to negotiate with them at the moment. Anyway, that was the American perspective of things. The head of the Russian delegation, Sergei Ryabkov, has also been giving interviews. On the 6th of January, he gave a massive interview to the Russian newspaper Izvestia, and he's followed up with a further interview to the Russian media over the course of today, of which, however, I don't have a complete transcript. However, Sputnik has provided us with extensive extracts from this interview, and they show that Ryabkov and the Russians are in an uncompromising mood. So let's begin. This is extracts, as I said, from that interview taken from Sputnik. We have Ryabkov saying as follows: I can say that the demands of the United States and other NATO countries that we carry out some de-escalation measures on our territory are out of the question. So, no question of the Russians reducing their troop numbers in European Russia. No question of the Russians agreeing to drills to reduce the drills and exercises by their military on their own territory. He then goes on to say, this is a non-starter in the literal sense of the word. If the Americans want to talk about changing our approach, for example, for the Minsk package of measures on peace in Ukraine, or even stutter about something like Crimea, this also has no chance for discussions. So, any idea that the Russians would agree to take on some extra commitments over and above those in the Minsk agreement? Commitments, as I said, which up to now they haven't made. Well, that's a non-starter. Any idea that they would agree to be made a party to the Ukrainian conflict? That's a non-starter too. Then we go on to hear that Ryabkov say, Russia has not been thrown off balance by the tough position set by the US and its allies ahead of the week's security talks. The US position is quite tough. By all indications, it has interlocked completely with the position which our neighbours in the West and the one of our direct neighbours from the so-called Bucharest 9 group of countries have been working out over the past weeks. And of course, the NATO Secretariat is adding fire. That's a reference to Stoltenberg, something burning with fire on this subject. But we have seen worse, and this does not throw us off balance. We will explain persistently our logic and present arguments in support of our position. And then Sputnik says that Ryabkov noted that Russia is prepared to conduct an article-by-article discussion of the two security treaty proposals, but then he went on to say whether or not our American colleagues will be inclined for such a conversation, I have my doubts based on the signals we have heard over the past few days. And he then is quoted further as saying, even a layman understands that demanding concessions from Russia in a situation where NATO has been striving throughout the past decades to drive back our country and turn it, if not into a subordinate, then at least to a secondary role in European and security politics, and to do so with direct damage to our security, will no longer work. This is all in the past. NATO needs to collect up its belongings and go back to the borders of 1997. And then when asked what he therefore expects from the talks, because there's no realistic way that the Americans are going to agree to that tomorrow in Geneva, Ryabkov went on to say, for us, a positive result would be a non-rejection of the set of priorities which we have formulated and readiness to continue working on them. So he's prepared to sit down, to explain his position, to explain Russia's position, to see whether the US is prepared to respond positively, or at least to any part of these proposals, but at the same time, on the essentials, he is taking an absolutely uncompromising side. And by the way, other Russian media reports say that Ryabkov made it also clear that the Russians are completely unimpressed and unfazed by all this talk of sanctions. I'm sure that they've read the articles in CNN and elsewhere about the blowback on the United States of imposing those sanctions, and are as skeptical as I am that the United States would really want to go that far. But in any event, as I've said already, my sense is that the Russians are, if not fully prepared to meet the sanctions challenge, they are in line to do that shortly. And even if such sanctions were imposed on them today, then it would take them only a fairly limited time before they fully adjusted to them and their economy continued to grow and function much as it has been doing over the last few years, despite all the sanctions pressure which has been imposed in the past. So there we are. Muddle, confusion, doubt on the American side, and no real new thinking. A very clear position from the Russians, but an almost certain deadlock to the negotiations which are coming in Geneva. By the way, Ryabkov made it fairly clear in an earlier interview, the earlier interview that he gave on the 6th of January to Izvestia. I'm providing a link to that, but he made it fairly clear, at least on my reading, that if the Russians came up against a brick wall, if the United States refused to discuss anything, then they were quite willing to walk away from the discussions entirely. In other words, they were willing to pull out. Now, one thing the Russians have not made clear is what happens if the negotiations do completely break down. Something which, as I have said, because the United States is so nervous about imposing these sort of sanctions, and because the United States is so worried about the ramifications of a crisis in Ukraine, a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, something which I suspect the Americans will strive to avoid. But let's assume that does happen, and it is a distinct possibility, especially with a weak negotiator like Wendy Sherman leading the American team. What will the Russians in that case do? Will they invade Ukraine? Will they launch a war against Ukraine? Well, they could do. We've learnt from all kinds of sources now, I've done several programs about this, that if there was a war between Ukraine and Russia, the Ukrainian military would be defeated in short order. Even Ukraine's own military commanders admit as much. We've had all kinds of brave talk over the last couple of weeks about how, in that event, Ukraine would resort to partisan warfare. And there's rumours circulating that General Milley, the chairman of the US Combined Chiefs of Staff, told General Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, that in the event of a war in Ukraine, the United States would arm the partisans fighting the Russian military in Ukraine with Javelin and Stinger missiles. All I can say about that is that I think this talk of a partisan war is a fantasy. Very, very rapidly, the Russians would take control of all the territory east of the Dnieper River, places like Kharkiv, Odessa, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Nikolaev, and all of the rest. These sort of places are Russian-speaking. They are antagonistic to the government in Kiev. I think it is most unlikely that there would be organized resistance in these areas. As for the suggestion that the Russians would march further east, all the way to Kiev, Well, perhaps they could do that. And in truth, if they did do that, I think again, the idea that there would be a massive partisan uprising to resist them is a fantasy. It is Western wishful thinking. But as it happens, I don't think that the Russians will want to do that because, to be straightforward about it, I don't think they're interested in conquering, at least not in that way, central and western Ukraine. I think they will feel that with Ukraine effectively cut off from the sea, sooner or later, whatever rump government was left in Kiev would be forced to come to terms, and I think they would prefer that rather than take on the cost and trouble of expanding their area of control throughout central Ukraine. And I've also expressed my view that those sort of people who might be inclined to fight the Russians, or who might in theory be inclined to fight the Russians, are much more likely in that kind of event, in the event that something like this were to happen, they're much more likely to emigrate to the West. Now, I don't think that this is, however, the Russian game plan. I don't think the Russians are planning an invasion of Ukraine. They're certainly building up their military east infrastructure in European Russia, and they're doing so at an accelerating pace. Over the course of 2022, we're likely to see increasing numbers, for example, of the T-14 armored tank and its associated vehicles start to be deployed in the Russian army. We're probably going to see rather more Sukhoi 57 fighter jets, but they're not going to be there in vast quantities, at least not in 2022. But certainly the Russians are building up their military forces in European Russia, and they've been doing it for a long time now, and no doubt that will accelerate. But I don't think that the Russians are doing that with any plan to invade Ukraine. They have, after all, repeatedly denied any such intention. They made it very clear that if Ukraine attacks the Donbass, the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, that for them is a red line. And at that point, the Russians now have all the troops and machinery in place to launch an overwhelming counteroffensive, which will result in the destruction of Ukraine's military and which will create a crisis for Ukraine, probably an existential one. But that would be a reactive war. If Ukraine were to take steps to join NATO, then of course the Russians would respond in a similar sort of way. They made it very clear that that also is a red line. If offensive weapons, like the kind of missiles that the senior administration official was talking about, were deployed in Ukraine, well, the Russians would react to that too. That makes all the talk, in my opinion, of NATO, of Ukraine joining NATO, of the US deploying missiles to Ukraine, that makes all that talk, that has already nullified it, because the United States will not want a war with Russia in Ukraine, which would oblige it to impose sanctions on Russia, which would cause enormous damage to the European economy and severe damage to the American. So all the talk about NATO expansion into Ukraine, into Georgia as well, all talk about deploying sophisticated weapons, about offensive weapons to Ukraine, all that already is ended. It's over. The Russians do not need to bargain with the Americans over this issue because, in effect, it's already not going to happen. So, what then? Given that that is so, what then, if they're not going to invade Ukraine, if they've already achieved much of what they want by imposing their red lines, what will the Russians do if the Americans refuse the legally binding security guarantees that the Russians are seeking? If the US doesn't do that which the that which Ryabkov says they need to do, collect all their belongings and go back to the borders of NATO that NATO had in up to 1997. What will the Russians do? Well, I think I've already discussed this in previous programs. Programs, by the way, that extend all the way back to the early summer. They will start to deploy in growing numbers all the new military and weapon systems that I've been talking about in many programs. The Poseidon nuclear-powered submarine drone with its massive multi-megaton nuclear warhead, which can wreak extraordinary devastation on the US coast. By the way, there's been more information about this system over the last few weeks. It now turns out that it is going to be highly stealthy, that it operates, that it moves at basically creep speeds, all of which suggests that the thing that I was most concerned about when I did my program about this Poseidon nuclear-powered submarine drone, you can scroll back through my old videos and you can find it. The thing I was most worried about it then, that it would be deployed and operate autonomously in mid-ocean, probably for months at a time, or at least weeks at a time, until it was recalled to its mothership for refitting. That, it seems, is the reality of how this system is going to work. So we would have these weapon systems, these deadly weapon systems, able to devastate the US east and west coast, operating in the Atlantic and perhaps even more alarmingly in the Pacific. The Russians have deployed the first submarine, the Belgorod, which is capable of launching these systems to the Pacific, suggesting that this will be a primary area for deployment of these Poseidon drones. And of course, they can reach cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles via the Pacific. And of course, any idea that the United States can track and find them over the vast expanses over the Pacific Ocean at the very same time as it is facing a growing challenge from the Chinese Navy. All of that, I think, is fantastic. So that is going to be a major concern, a massive concern for the United States. The sense that these drones will be there under the water, apparently not deep under the water, stealth boats and drones operate not very far below the surface, but they will be there below the surface, operating in the Pacific, ready, presumably on instruction from Moscow, to launch strikes on US coastal cities. The US won't know where they are. It won't know what distance from the coast they are. They will be an extremely worrying and alarming reality that the United States might face if it doesn't agree to negotiate with the Russians on these sort of treaties that the Russians are talking about. And of course, it won't just be the Poseidon submarine drone. It will be other weapon systems. It will be the nuclear-powered cruise missile system that the Russians are already deploying. We don't know how long or far that system can function, since it is also nuclear-powered, it can loiter for any stretch of time. Be much easier to track, would hardly be stealthy, but it would be, again, an unnerving thing if it was flying and circling around, perhaps over the Arctic or who knows where. And, of course, there's all sorts of other weapon systems as well. And last but not least, the Russians do have that gun that they're pointing at the West, the gun that is all those conventional military forces stationed in European Russia, able at any time to launch a counterattack in Ukraine, one which the United States would be obliged to respond to, by sanctions, which if they're too weak would only humiliate it, and if which they're too strong would unsettle and cause damage to its own economy. So I think that is the direction in which things are moving. Now, how long before all this happens? A lot of people have talked about these draft treaties that the Russians have made and the proposals that preceded them as ultimatums. And I've consistently said that these were not quite ultimatums, and Putin has denied it. And Ryabkov, in one of the interviews that he has given, the one to Izvestia on the 6th of January, he has made it clear that it is not an ultimatum, it is a warning. And he's right. An ultimatum, as I said, is where action is demanded with consequences immediately following if that action is not taken. And that is not what the Russians have done. And Ryabkov also said that the Russians, for the time being, haven't set or haven't imposed any deadlines, certainly not upon the Americans. But though the Russians have not set any deadlines, that doesn't mean that they don't have plans about what they're going to do. They wouldn't have made these demands if they hadn't some intention of acting upon them. I think that we're going to see a steady increase of tension in Europe and in the North Atlantic and in the Arctic, and it seems quite plausibly now in the Pacific as well, so long as the United States refuses to negotiate with the Russians on these Russian demands. We will start to see these Poseidon drones being deployed, which will be very unnerving for the Americans. We will see the continuing build-up of Russian ground forces in European Russia. We will see the Russians working further ahead with the Chinese to develop resilient alternative financial systems immune to US sanctions. We will see the Russians also taking other steps to diversify their energy exports. They're already building another pipeline to China. They've already got one built. They're now negotiating with India to do the same. And at some point, and I suspect it will be within a period of about 3 years, perhaps 4, we will see that these demands that the Russians have made, these warnings that the Russians have given, they will be reframed eventually when the Russians are ready into a definite ultimatum. 2024, 2025, perhaps a little earlier, 2023 conceivably. This is the time frame to look at, 2023 to 2025. And at the moment, the Russians are laying the groundwork for all of those things. The US, as I said, has come up with no coherent response to them. Anyway, it's clear, therefore, we're not going to see any great breakthroughs in Geneva. But the Russians have already achieved a number of things. They've set out their red lines, and they've made the Americans take note of them. They've demonstrated the growth of their military power in Europe, and the United States has no response to it. They've, in effect, demonstrated to the United States that any further sanctions upon them will have a feedback effect on the European economy and on the United States as well. And of course, they've set the scene for that day, not in terms of historical time or even political time, that very far away day, when the demands do become an ultimatum and the United States is faced either with capitulation or an escalation which would prove catastrophic and massively damaging to itself. I've spoken repeatedly in program after program about the overcommitments crisis that the United States is facing and about the US need to seek a geostrategic ceasefire with its adversaries. The talks that are about to take place in Geneva today and tomorrow ought to be an opportunity to start shifting the direction of the ship. Some people in the United States appear to have some understanding of the problems, and as I said, we can already see the dissensions, the signs of dissension between people like Blinken, who are furious at being told the realities, both by their own State Department and Treasury teams, and presumably hearing them also from other people within the government, and having the politics of this explained to them by the Democratic Party strategists in the DNC and such like. So we can already see dissension and division there. We can see dissension and division in Europe, with the Germans and the French directly talking directly to the Russians, intent on sending officials to Moscow, with Chancellor Scholz of Germany now seeking apparently a summit meeting with Putin. And we can also see it, by the way, in the fact that apparently a decision has been made by the administration and by the Democratic Party, in other words, by the DNC, that they will block this sanctions package on Nord Stream 2, proposed by the likes of Ted Cruz, allowing Nord Stream 2 to proceed unimpeded once the certification process is concluded in June. So we can see that there are glimmers of realism within the administration, but that the forces that make compromise possible are still very weak, and that the United States still hasn't formulated a clear position. This is going to be a tense time in Europe and between East-West relations. A few weeks ago, in that speech in which he first floated the idea of legally binding security guarantees, Vladimir Putin, in that speech Vladimir Putin made to the Collegium of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Putin specifically mentioned Russia pursuing a strategy of tension until those guarantees are conceded. That strategy of tension is now at play, and I suspect, in fact I fully predict, that over the next few weeks, months, years even, it will get ever more intense, and it will get worse and worse. With the United States facing challenges from China in the Pacific, I'll repeat it again what I have said many times in the past. The US's interest is to come to some kind of agreement now. It would have to be. Ryabkov has made this very clear on the lines, at least the sort of lines, that the Russians are proposing. It has to concede in some respect now, or it risks in 3, 4, 5 years' time, perhaps sooner, perhaps later, having to concede far more than it needs to concede now. Whether that wisdom exists in Washington, whether that understanding exists in Washington, whether it exists in European capitals, well, that remains to be seen. In the meantime, as I said, we've got to buckle up and prepare for a bumpy road ahead. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and on our other channel, our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. And please also remember, by the way, to check out Alex's own channel. You'll find links under this video. And you can, of course, also join us on our other platforms, especially locals, where I now routinely publish, at least I routinely do live streams every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time. Every Wednesday, you can join me there. You can put questions to me if you like, and you can have me answer you directly at that over the course of that live stream. And you can also publish exclusive content on Locals and read the other the exclusive content that we also publish on Locals. For example, my various discussions of US domestic politics, which of course other members of the community also make, and the various discussions that take place there about the pandemic and other related issues. We have a wide range of opinions on our Locals platform about those issues. And you can also, of course, find us on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, which is now, of course, merging or united with Locals, Odyssey, and of course the new free speech platform SuperU. And you can also support us if you like our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying yourself the wonderful merchandise you will find there, our sweatshirts, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, and of course our famous magic mugs, including this new Good Day magic mug. And also please remember to tick the like button to this video if you've liked this video, and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day until then.